Welcome, my friends, to a journey through one of the most turbulent chapters in human history, the scramble for Africa. Over the next moments, you and I will travel across time, witnessing how an entire continent, rich in culture, tradition, and resources, was suddenly thrust into a storm of ambition, greed, and power. This is not just a history lesson, it is a story of human struggle, survival, and resilience. We will meet kings and conquerors, visionaries and villains, warriors and survivors. We will see how lines drawn on a map thousands of miles away reshape the lives of millions forever. But most importantly, we will explore the untold stories, the voices too often silenced, the mothers, fathers, and children whose destinies were rewritten without their consent. As you watch, ask yourself, what lessons does this past leave us for today? For the shadows of the scramble still stretch across modern borders, politics, and conflicts. So sit back, open your heart, and prepare your mind. Let us walk together into a history carved by courage and cruelty, by pain and perseverance. This is the scramble for Africa, and its story begins now. Imagine your homeland divided overnight. Imagine strangers arriving on your shores with guns in their hands and flags in their pockets, claiming your rivers, your forests, your children's future, as if you were invisible. This was the reality for Africa in the late 19th century. A vast continent, home to ancient kingdoms, thriving trade networks, and rich cultures, was suddenly treated as a prize to be seized. To European powers, Africa was not a home to millions of people. It was a treasure chest to be unlocked, a battlefield to be conquered, a map to be carved. But history is not only written by conquerors, it is carried in the cries of those who resisted, in the silence of those who endured, and in the voices we revive today. This is not just the story of Europe's conquest, it is the story of Africa's survival, and it begins now. Before the storm of conquest and colonization swept across Africa, the continent was not a dark place waiting to be discovered. It was a world rich with kingdoms, cultures, and connections. In the early 19th century, Africa was a mosaic of civilizations, each with its own rhythms, laws, and ways of life. In West Africa, the Ashanti Empire thrived, with golden thrones and powerful armies. In the East, the Swahili coast bustled with trade, ivory, spices, and fabrics moving across the Indian Ocean. Ethiopia stood proud, an ancient Christian kingdom tracing its roots to the Queen of Sheba. To the south, the Zulu under Shaka reshaped warfare and power. The Sahara was no barrier but a bridge. Camel caravans carried salt, gold, and ideas across its sands. African societies were not uniform. They were as diverse as the landscapes from the forests of the Congo Basin to the savannas of the Sahel. Some communities were centralized kingdoms, others were village-based societies bound by kinship. But together they shared a deep connection to land, ancestry, and spirituality. Life in these communities pulsed with rhythm. Drums echoed through villages at dusk. Markets overflowed with goods. Kola nuts, palm oil, woven cloth. Storytellers, or griots, carried histories in song and poetry, preserving the memory of ancestors. Elders sat beneath baobab trees, settling disputes with wisdom. Contrary to the European image of emptiness, Africa was already connected to the wider world. Scholars studied in Timbuktu, traders bargained in Zanzibar, and kings corresponded with foreign leaders. Yet beneath this vibrancy, storm clouds gathered. For centuries, the transatlantic slave trade had torn millions away, leaving scars. And soon, new intruders would arrive. Men with maps, missionaries with Bibles, merchants with insatiable hunger. But here, before the storm, we see Africa as it truly was, a continent alive with sovereignty, creativity, and resilience. It was not waiting to be discovered. It was waiting to be defended. Long before Europe's conquest of Africa, the first contacts between Africans and Europeans were marked by curiosity, trade, and fragile alliances. These encounters began as early as the 15th century, when Portuguese sailors, driven by the lure of spices and gold, reached the coasts of West Africa. Their caravels carried cannons, crucifixes, and cargo, symbols of a world eager to expand. At first, contact was limited to the coasts. African rulers, cautious yet pragmatic, negotiated with these strange newcomers. Gold dust, ivory, and pepper moved into European hands, while firearms, textiles, and glass beads flowed ashore. For many kingdoms, trade was not submission but strategy, a way to strengthen their power at home. Along the Swahili coast, merchants who had long traded with Arabs and Persians now met Europeans with both skepticism and opportunity. In Congo, King Nzinga Nku welcomed the Portuguese in the late 1400s, even converting to Christianity and taking the name João Thurf. His son, King Afonso I, embraced European alliances, sending letters to the King of Portugal. Yet, as centuries passed, these ties became chains. Missionaries followed the traders, holding crosses high and preaching salvation. They sought not only to spread faith, but also to reshape African societies in Europe's image. Schools and churches were established, but with them came pressure to abandon ancestral traditions. But not all contacts were peaceful. Along the coastlines, some communities resisted fiercely, rejecting foreign intrusion. Others were drawn into devastating slave raids. As demand for human labor in the Americas grew, what began as trade soon spiraled into exploitation. Still, in these early years, Africa held its ground. The vast interior remained untouched, its kingdoms sovereign, its people strong. To the European mind, however, these first exchanges were only the beginning. They were the first cracks in a door that would soon be flung wide open, a door leading to conquest, colonization, and a struggle for the soul of Africa. Before the scramble for Africa came the centuries-long shadow of the transatlantic slave trade. From the 1500s to the 1800s, over 12 million Africans were captured, sold, and shipped across the Atlantic. Entire villages vanished overnight. Drums that once echoed with celebration now mourned with grief. On the coast, forts like Elmina Castle in West Africa became prisons of despair. Behind stone walls, men, women, and children were crammed into dungeons, awaiting the Middle Passage, a journey that few survived. Shackled together, they were loaded into ships like cargo. Disease, suffocation, and despair claimed countless lives before they ever reached foreign shores. But the impact stretched beyond the coast. Raiding and warfare intensified as some African leaders traded captives for European guns, fueling cycles of violence. Families were torn apart, traditions disrupted, and kingdoms destabilized. Yet even in chains, resilience burned. Stories, songs, and prayers traveled across the ocean with the enslaved. From Haiti to Brazil, revolts rose, and within Africa, resistance stirred against the slavers. By the late 19th century, the slave trade was outlawed, but its scars ran deep. It left Africa vulnerable, its population weakened, its societies fractured. This would make the continent even more vulnerable when Europe's hunger for empire reached its peak. By the mid-19th century, the transatlantic slave trade had declined, but Africa still attracted outsiders. Now, explorers replaced slavers, and discovery became the obsession of European adventurers. David Livingstone, a Scottish missionary and explorer, wandered deep into the African interior, seeking rivers and trade routes that Europeans had never mapped. He wrote of Africa's beauty, its rivers, waterfalls, and people. He believed Christianity, commerce, and civilization would replace slavery. Yet his journeys paved the way for something darker: conquest. Henry Morton Stanley, sent by newspapers to find Livingstone, turned exploration into spectacle. His famous words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," echoed across Europe. But beyond the headlines, Stanley was ruthless, carving paths with violence, often leaving devastation behind. European explorers raced to map rivers like the Congo and Nile. For Africa, these journeys were not mere adventures. They were the first steps of invasion. Each map drawn, each river charted, was a blueprint for colonization. Africans watched with both curiosity and suspicion. Who were these strangers who marched inland with guns, notebooks, and strange instruments? They came not as guests, but as heralds of a new storm. By the late 19th century, Europe stood at the height of its industrial revolution. Steam engines roared, factories poured smoke into the skies, and empires stretched across continents. Yet Europe's hunger for power was insatiable, and Africa was its next target. Raw materials fueled Europe's growth: coal, iron, and cotton. But soon they craved Africa's treasures: gold, diamonds, ivory, and rubber. Each colony was not just land, but profit. European leaders saw Africa as a blank canvas for their ambitions, ignoring the millions who already lived there. Britain dreamed of a chain of colonies from Cape to Cairo. France envisioned a vast empire stretching across West Africa. Germany, newly united, sought its share of glory. Even smaller powers like Portugal, Spain, and Italy rushed to stake their claims. In European capitals, newspapers painted Africa as a place of riches and adventure. Politicians spoke of civilizing missions. Businessmen calculated fortunes. Missionaries preached salvation. Yet behind these noble words lay greed. For Africans, whispers of the coming storm grew louder. The world around them was shifting. Ships crowded their coasts. Foreign flags appeared on forts. And soon conferences in distant cities would decide their fate without their voices. The hunger of Europe had been unleashed, and it pointed straight at Africa. In 1884, the fate of an entire continent was decided in a glittering hall in Berlin. Leaders of Europe gathered not to negotiate with Africans, but to divide Africa among themselves. 14 nations sent delegates: Germany, Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, and others, all eager to carve their share of Africa's wealth. The conference, hosted by Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, draped the language of civilization and progress over the reality of greed. Maps of Africa were spread across tables, pens scratched as borders were drawn, straight lines cutting through rivers, deserts, and homelands, ignoring tribes, cultures, and histories. No African leaders were invited. Not one voice from the continent was heard. In European capitals, it was celebrated as diplomacy. In Africa, it would be remembered as betrayal. The Berlin Conference gave birth to the rules of the game. A nation could claim territory if it established authority there. This unleashed a race, as European soldiers, merchants, and administrators scrambled inland. It was here, in that smoke-filled room, that the destiny of millions was sealed with ink. The map of Africa was redrawn, not by Africans, but by men who had never walked its soil. After Berlin, the maps of Africa looked different. New borders were drawn with rulers and compasses, not with respect for people or history. Entire ethnic groups were cut in half. Hausa, Yoruba, Somali, Maasai split into different colonies. Old rivals were forced together under one flag. These borders planted seeds of conflict. Families found themselves under different rulers. Traders discovered their markets disrupted. Sacred lands were now territories owned by foreigners. Colonial officials marked boundaries with posts, flags, and treaties few Africans could read. When locals resisted, force made the border real. Villages burned, warriors slaughtered, leaders captured. To Europeans, these lines were neat and convenient. To Africans, they were scars across the land. The wounds left by these artificial borders would outlast the empires that drew them. Even today, many conflicts trace back to the careless lines carved in Berlin. Britain's empire stretched across the seas, and Africa became the crown jewel of its ambitions. Politicians like Cecil Rhodes dreamed of a red line on the map from Cape to Cairo, a continuous chain of British territory. In the south, Britain took control of mineral-rich lands in South Africa, where diamonds and gold fueled both wealth and war. The Zulu were defeated, the Boer settlers confronted, and the mines swallowed African laborers. In the east, Britain claimed Kenya and Uganda, building railroads through savannas and highlands. The Lunatic Express, as it was called, cost thousands of lives but connected port to interior. Egypt too fell under British control, its Suez Canal the lifeline to India. Every colony was not just territory, it was a link in Britain's imperial chain. Africans were forced into plantations, railroads and mines. Taxes were imposed, and rebellion was crushed with iron discipline. Yet even here, resistance flickered, from the Nandi warriors of Kenya to the brave Zulu of the south. The Union Jack flew high, but beneath it Africa bled. While Britain claimed the east and south, France dreamed of empire in the west. From the Sahara to the Atlantic, French tricolor flags spread across vast lands, their ambition, a horizontal chain of colonies across West and Central Africa. French soldiers marched inland, conquering kingdoms with brutal efficiency. Resistance came from the mighty Samori Touré, who led his people against French guns with unmatched courage, yet his empire eventually fell. France brought the doctrine of assimilation. They sought not only to rule, but to transform Africans into French subjects, speaking French, practicing French laws, adopting French customs. Schools and missions spread, but so too did forced labor, taxation, and loss of sovereignty. Paris celebrated its civilizing mission, but in villages across West Africa, families mourned their dead, conscripted into colonial armies or taken as workers. Still, African resilience never broke. Even under French rule, cultures endured, languages survived, and identities remained strong. No colonial story is darker than Belgium's in the Congo. King Leopold II of Belgium claimed the Congo Free State as his personal possession, not a national colony but his private empire. Behind a mask of philanthropy, Leopold promised to end slavery and bring civilization. In truth, he unleashed horror. Vast forests were stripped for rubber, villages burned for profit, and millions enslaved under his rule. Armed sentries cut off the hands of workers who failed rubber quotas. Children were taken hostage to force their parents to labor. Women were violated, men whipped, whole communities erased. Missionaries and journalists eventually exposed the atrocities, shocking the world, but the damage was done. Between 1885 and 1908, millions perished in what some call the first genocide of the modern age. The Congo Free State became a symbol of colonial greed at its most brutal. It was not just the conquest of land, but the destruction of humanity. Germany, newly unified under Otto von Bismarck, arrived late to the scramble for empire, but with fierce ambition. While Britain and France already claimed vast territories, Germany moved quickly to secure colonies across Africa in the 1880s. German traders and explorers paved the way, followed by soldiers and administrators. Soon, flags were planted in Southwest Africa, Namibia, East Africa, Tanzania, Togo, and Cameroon. But German colonial rule was brutal and uncompromising. In Southwest Africa, German settlers seized land from the Herero and Nama peoples. When resistance arose, the response was catastrophic. Between 1904 and 1908, German forces waged a campaign of extermination, driving men, women, and children into the desert, poisoning wells, and setting up concentration camps. Historians today recognize it as one of the first genocides of the 20th century. In East Africa, resistance burned in the Maji-Maji Rebellion, 1905-1907, as diverse ethnic groups united against German authority. Believing sacred water, Maji would protect them from bullets. Warriors charged bravely, but were slaughtered. Tens of thousands perished. For Germany, Africa was a stage for proving imperial might. For Africans, it was a battlefield of blood and defiance. Long before the Scramble, Portugal and Spain had explored Africa's coasts, but by the 19th century, their power had waned. Still, they clung to imperial dreams. Portugal sought to revive its empire. In the south, Angola became its stronghold, where forced labor fed plantations. To the east, Mozambique fell under Lisbon's control. Portuguese rule was harsh, with peasants compelled to work under brutal quotas. Resistance simmered, but European alliances kept Portugal entrenched. Spain, weaker still, managed only fragments of empire, Equatorial Guinea, and parts of Morocco and the Western Sahara. Spanish colonies were small, but their presence reminded Africans that no corner of the continent was free from European hunger. For both nations, Africa was less about power and more about survival, clinging to their status as empires in decline. Yet for Africans in Angola, Mozambique and Equatorial Guinea, the yoke of oppression was as heavy as anywhere. Italy, a young nation seeking recognition, joined the scramble with high hopes but faced humiliating defeats. Its ambitions focused on the Horn of Africa, modern Eritrea, Somalia, and Ethiopia. In 1896, Italy invaded Ethiopia, expecting easy victory. Instead, at the Battle of Adwa, Emperor Menelik II united his people, rallying tens of thousands of warriors armed with both modern weapons and fierce determination. Ethiopia crushed the Italians, marking the first time an African army defeated a European power in modern history. Adwa became a symbol of African resistance and pride. Songs celebrated Menelik's triumph, and across the continent, whispers spread: Europe was not invincible. Italy, humiliated, retreated, but later returned, occupying Libya in 1911 and trying again in Ethiopia in the 1930s under Mussolini. Yet Adwa remained a shining moment when Africa wrote its own destiny. Not all of Africa bowed to foreign power. In southern Africa, the Zulu nation, forged under the legendary Shaka Zulu, resisted with strength and unity. Though Shaka had died before the scramble, his legacy shaped Zulu resistance. In 1879, at the Battle of Esandalwana, Zulu warriors armed with spears and shields defeated a British army equipped with rifles and cannons. It was a stunning victory, shocking the world. But Britain responded with overwhelming force. Later that year, the Zulu were crushed at Ulundi. Their kingdom was broken, their land seized, but their courage remained legend. The Zulu showed that African armies could match Europe's might. Their bravery echoed across the continent, inspiring others to resist. Ethiopia stood apart from much of Africa during the scramble. Guided by Emperor Menelik II, it remained fiercely independent. At Adwa, in 1896, Ethiopia's victory was not only military but symbolic. Menelik carefully played European powers against each other, securing modern rifles while uniting Ethiopia's diverse peoples. When Italy attempted to impose a protectorate, Menelik declared war. The battle was fierce. Italian forces underestimated Ethiopia's strength. Tens of thousands of Ethiopian warriors overwhelmed them, forcing Italy into retreat. The Treaty of Addis Ababa recognized Ethiopia's sovereignty, making it one of only 2 African nations to resist colonization successfully, alongside Liberia. Adwa became a beacon of hope. Across Africa and the diaspora, it symbolized defiance and dignity. Ethiopia stood as proof that Africa was not powerless, it could triumph. When European empires carved Africa, missionaries followed close behind. For centuries, Christian missions had existed on the fringes of the continent, but the late 19th century brought an explosion of missionary activity. Missionaries came with Bibles in hand, preaching salvation, education, and civilization. Schools and churches were built in villages, often with the promise of literacy and medicine. To many Africans, these new tools brought opportunities: learning to read, gaining access to foreign trade, and discovering new knowledge. Yet, beneath the promise lay pressure. Children were taught to abandon ancestral languages and traditions. Masks and drums were condemned as pagan. Sacred rituals were replaced by hymns and prayers in foreign tongues. In some villages, chiefs welcomed missionaries, hoping education would strengthen their people. In others, suspicion and resistance remained. Missionaries were not only preachers, they were often the first spies of empire. Their reports of geography, resources, and local politics found their way into the hands of colonial officials. Schools became training grounds for clerks and soldiers who would serve under colonial rule. But even here, Africa resisted. Many embraced education but refused cultural erasure, blending new knowledge with old traditions. Mission schools unintentionally produced a new generation of African leaders, teachers, writers, pastors, who would one day lead the struggle for independence. The true prize of Africa was not land alone, it was resources. Beneath the soil lay diamonds, gold, copper, ivory, and later, rubber. European empires extracted these riches at unimaginable cost. In South Africa, vast mines swallowed African laborers, who worked long hours under brutal conditions for a pittance. Diamonds from Kimberley and gold from Witwatersrand filled European vaults, while miners lived in shacks and faced disease, cave-ins, and exhaustion. In the Congo, rubber became blood. Villagers were forced to tap wild vines, and quotas were enforced with whips and mutilation. Hands were severed for failure, terrorizing entire communities. Ivory carved from elephant tusks decorated European parlors. Palm oil from West Africa greased the wheels of industry. Copper and tin powered factories far from the land they were taken from. The cycle was relentless. Resources flowed out, wealth flowed into Europe, and Africa remained impoverished. Forests fell, rivers ran red, and generations were trapped in labor. But exploitation also bred defiance. Workers fled into forests, sabotaged equipment, or whispered songs of resistance as they labored. Every diamond, every drop of rubber, carried not just profit, but pain. Colonial empires were not built with consent, they were built with chains. Across Africa, forced labor became the backbone of empire. Africans were compelled to build roads, railways, and plantations. They dug canals, carried stones, harvested crops, and tapped rubber, all under threat of violence. Colonial authorities imposed taxes not in coins but in labor. Men who could not pay were forced into work camps. Women carried loads for miles, while children were seized to ensure compliance. Whips cracked over the backs of workers, and villages that resisted were burned to the ground. In French West Africa, the corvée system demanded weeks of unpaid labor from every man. In Portuguese Angola and Mozambique, contract labor was little more than slavery. In the Congo, families were held hostage until rubber quotas were met. The work was endless, the suffering immense. Exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease killed thousands. Yet behind every colonial railway, every port, every glittering European fortune, were African hands, scarred, bleeding, and unfree. But Africans resisted. Some fled into forests, sabotaged machinery, or slowed their work in acts of quiet defiance. Songs of sorrow became songs of endurance, carrying hope that one day, the chains would break. If forced labor was the muscle of empire, infrastructure was its skeleton. Railroads and riverboats became the arteries of colonial power, designed not for Africans but for the extraction of resources. In East Africa, Britain built the Uganda Railway, nicknamed the Lunatic Express. It cut across savannas and highlands at terrible cost. Thousands of Indian laborers were brought in, alongside Africans, to lay tracks through hostile terrain. Disease, exhaustion, and wild animals claimed countless lives. The infamous man-eaters of Tsavo lions killed dozens of workers. In the Congo, riverboats carried rubber and ivory down the Congo River, guarded by armed patrols. In South Africa, rail lines connected diamond and gold mines to ports, feeding Europe's hunger for wealth. To colonial rulers, these projects were triumphs of engineering. To Africans, they were monuments of suffering. Railroads bypassed villages, destroyed sacred lands, and carried away riches that never returned. Yet infrastructure also had unintended consequences. Roads and railways that carried oppression also carried ideas. Along the tracks, whispers of resistance traveled. Workers shared grievances, spread news, and dreamed of liberation. What was built to serve empire would one day help dismantle it. Colonial conquest did not rely on guns alone. It thrived on division, a strategy known as divide and rule. European rulers quickly learned that to control vast populations, they had to weaken unity and sow mistrust among African communities. Traditional rivalries were exploited. Tribes that had once lived side by side were turned against each other through favoritism. Colonial officials granted certain groups privileges, jobs as clerks, soldiers, or administrators, while others were marginalized. This created resentment that fractured societies from within. In Rwanda, Belgian officials emphasized ethnic differences, elevating the Tutsi minority above the Hutu majority. In Nigeria, the British governed through indirect rule, empowering some chiefs while undermining others, igniting new tensions. In Kenya, land was seized and given to settlers, pitting displaced Africans against those who collaborated. Religion and education also became tools of division. Those who attended mission schools gained opportunities denied to others, creating an elite class more loyal to colonial powers than to their own people. The method was effective. While Africans argued and mistrusted one another, European control tightened. But beneath the surface, resentment grew. Divide and rule planted seeds of mistrust that would outlast colonialism itself, shaping conflicts that echo even into the modern era. The empires believed they had mastered Africa by dividing it, but in time, those same divisions would spark the fires of liberation movements, proving that unity, once rediscovered, was stronger than any colonial chain. Colonial conquest was not only about controlling land and resources, it was also about controlling identity. Across Africa, European rulers sought to erase cultures, languages, and traditions, replacing them with their own. Missionaries and colonial schools became key tools. Children were punished for speaking their native languages and forced to adopt English, French, Portuguese, or German. Traditional names were replaced by Christian ones. Drums, dances, and ancestral rituals were labeled pagan and forbidden. Clothing changed too. Colonized people were told to abandon traditional garments for European suits, uniforms, and dresses. Hairstyles were mocked, customs ridiculed, and histories rewritten to glorify empire. Libraries of oral tradition were silenced as griots and elders were ignored, while European textbooks claimed Africa had no history before colonization. Religion was a battleground. Christianity spread rapidly, sometimes embraced for the hope it offered, but often at the cost of suppressing indigenous beliefs. Sacred shrines were destroyed, and priests of traditional faiths were shunned. This cultural erasure was not total. Africans resisted by blending old and new, creating hybrid identities. Songs of sorrow carried hidden messages. Languages survived in whispers, art adapted, weaving colonial images into traditional designs. Culture bent but did not break. Colonial powers believed they were civilizing. In truth, they were dismantling centuries of memory. But beneath the surface, identity endured. Quietly, stubbornly, waiting for the day it would rise again. Colonial Africa was a world divided between rulers and the ruled, masters and subjects. For millions of Africans, daily life under empire was marked by hardship, humiliation, and survival. In villages, farmers were forced to grow cash crops, cotton, cocoa, coffee, rather than food for their families. Taxes had to be paid in colonial currency, pushing men to leave their homes to work in mines, railroads, or plantations. Families were split apart, with fathers absent for months or years. In towns, Africans lived in segregated quarters. Streets were divided, one for Europeans, another for natives. Hospitals, schools, and even benches in parks were marked by race. Africans were denied entry into colonial clubs, denied fair wages, denied dignity. Yet life was not only oppression, it was resilience. Women kept families alive, growing food in secret gardens when colonial quotas starved them. Elders told stories at night, keeping alive history's colonial textbooks erased. Music, dance, and oral traditions became acts of quiet rebellion, reminding the people of who they were. Children grew up in two worlds, one ruled by empire, the other rooted in tradition. Some carried books to colonial schools in the morning and sat by firelight, listening to their grandfathers' tales at night. Life under empire was heavy with chains, but within it pulsed an unbreakable rhythm, the heartbeat of Africa refusing to be silenced. In the story of colonial Africa, women were not silent witnesses. They were workers, mothers, leaders, and fighters, often carrying the heaviest burdens of empire. As men were pulled into mines, railroads, and plantations, women were left to sustain families and villages. They tilled the soil, fetched water, raised children, and kept traditions alive. In hidden gardens, they grew food for survival when colonial policies forced cash crops instead. Songs sung while pounding grain carried coded messages of defiance, weaving resistance into daily life. But women were more than caretakers, they were leaders. In West Africa, Yaa Asantewaa, Queen Mother of the Ashanti, led her people in battle against the British in 1900, declaring that if men would not fight, the women would. In southern Africa, women organized protests against taxes, land seizures, and pass laws. Women were also targets of oppression. Colonial armies violated them, labor systems exploited them, and mission schools demanded they abandon traditional roles. Yet women found ways to resist. Some smuggled food to warriors in the bush. Others used their positions as mothers to shield children from colonial recruitment. Even in silence, women preserved memory. They told stories, sang lullabies, and taught languages forbidden in schools. Their resilience ensured that cultures survived the onslaught of empire. The colonizers underestimated them, but without the strength of women, Africa's survival through the storm of empire would have been impossible. To maintain control, colonial empires relied not only on European soldiers but also on armies built from African recruits. These forces, often called askaris in East Africa or tirailleurs in French colonies, became both a weapon of empire and a painful symbol of division. Young men, sometimes volunteers seeking wages, were more often conscripted against their will. They wore European uniforms, carried rifles, and marched under foreign flags. In some cases, they were forced to fight against their own people, raiding villages, crushing rebellions, or guarding plantations. The British recruited thousands into the King's African Rifles. France enlisted tens of thousands of tirailleurs Senegalese who would later be sent to fight in Europe's wars. In German East Africa, African soldiers were led by strict German officers, drilled endlessly, and punished brutally. For many recruits, life in the colonial army was harsh. Pay was meager, punishments severe, and loyalty constantly tested. Yet some used their positions to protect their communities, passing on information to rebels or refusing to fire on kin. Colonial armies embodied the cruelty of divide and rule, Africans forced to fight Africans, controlled by powers from afar. But they also carried an irony: the very military training colonial rulers gave would later be turned against them in struggles for independence. Colonial rule thrived not only through European armies and administrators but also through African collaborators. Some chiefs, merchants, and soldiers sided with empire, whether out of ambition, survival, or betrayal. In many regions, colonial powers appointed chiefs who had never held authority before. These men enforced taxes, collected labor, and kept order on behalf of the empire. They were rewarded with land, guns, or European goods. But they were often despised by their own people, seen as traitors serving foreign masters. Merchants who aligned with colonizers profited from trade, ivory, rubber, and palm oil, while their communities bore the suffering. Some African soldiers, recruited into colonial armies, carried out brutal raids against neighboring villages, deepening divisions. Yet collaboration was rarely simple. Some leaders believed siding with Europeans could protect their people from worse destruction. Others sought power over rivals by aligning with colonizers. And some shifted loyalties, playing both sides in a desperate attempt to survive the storm. Still, betrayal cut deep. Stories spread of chiefs who handed rebels over to colonial prisons, of brothers who betrayed brothers for a handful of silver. These wounds left scars that lingered long after independence. Empire thrived on these divisions. But collaboration was also a gamble. For when resistance rose, those who had sided with empire often found themselves abandoned, condemned, or overthrown. Colonialism in Africa was never about charity or civilization. At its core, it was an economic machine, designed to extract wealth from the continent and feed the engines of Europe's empires. cash crops became king. In British colonies, Africans were forced to grow cotton, cocoa, coffee, and tea. In French West Africa, peanuts dominated. In the Congo, rubber was demanded at impossible quotas. These crops were not for local use. They were shipped to Europe, where industries profited, while African villages went hungry. Mines dug deep into the earth for gold, diamonds, and copper. African laborers toiled in darkness, earning pennies while European companies grew rich. In South Africa, companies like De Beers amassed fortunes, while miners lived in cramped compounds under constant surveillance. Taxes made the system inescapable. Africans were forced to pay in colonial currency, driving them into wage labor on plantations and in mines. Even huts and cattle were taxed. The empire reached into every household, ensuring that survival itself meant serving colonial interests. European companies became immensely wealthy, ports boomed, factories thrived, and colonial governments boasted of progress. Yet Africa remained impoverished. Roads and railways led only to mines and ports, carrying wealth away rather than developing local economies. Still, seeds of resistance grew here too. Africans who worked as clerks, dock workers, or miners saw firsthand the injustice of empire. They began to organize, to strike, and to whisper of a future where Africa's wealth would belong to Africans again. The economics of empire built glittering capitals in Europe while leaving behind villages in Africa stripped bare. It was profit paid for in sweat, blood, and broken lives. By the early 20th century, the weight of empire pressed heavily on Africa. Yet beneath the silence of oppression, a new spirit began to stir, a spirit of nationalism. This awakening did not appear overnight. It grew slowly, in schools, in churches, in cities, where Africans worked as clerks, dock workers, and soldiers. Those who learned European languages and studied in mission schools discovered the very ideas of liberty and justice that colonizers denied them. They read about democracy, freedom, and rights, and asked why these values were reserved only for Europeans. In West Africa, newspapers founded by Africans gave voice to grievances. Writers like John Mensa Sarba in the Gold Coast and Herbert Macaulay in Nigeria began questioning colonial policies. In East Africa, whispers of unity spread among dock workers in Mombasa and Dar es Salaam. Across the continent, returning soldiers who had fought in World War I demanded the dignity they had been promised but never received. Religion also played its role. Independent African churches broke away from European missions, blending Christianity with African traditions and asserting spiritual independence as a first step toward political freedom. These early movements were fragile, often crushed by colonial censorship and arrests, yet they planted seeds of unity, dignity, and resistance. Africans began to dream not only of survival under empire, but of reclaiming their future. The rise of nationalism was a fire beginning to smolder. It would grow stronger, chapter by chapter, until it consumed the very empires that thought themselves eternal. By the mid-23rd century, the whispers of resistance had grown into a chorus. Nationalism spread across Africa like wildfire, uniting workers, students, farmers, and intellectuals under a common dream: freedom. In cities, new political organizations emerged. In the Gold Coast, Kwame Nkrumah founded movements that rallied thousands under the banner of self-government now. In Kenya, the Mau Mau rose from the forests, waging a guerrilla war against British rule. In North Africa, nationalists in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia organized protests and revolts against French domination. Trade unions became powerful weapons. Railway workers, miners, and dock workers realized that their collective strength could paralyze colonial economies. Strikes erupted, shaking colonial administrations and proving that empire was not unbreakable. Students educated in Europe returned home with radical ideas, demanding independence and equality. Newspapers, pamphlets, and radio broadcasts carried slogans of liberation. Songs and poetry became tools of protest, uniting people across villages and cities. Colonial authorities responded with repression, arrests, censorship, and violence. Leaders were jailed, newspapers banned, protests crushed. Yet, each blow only fueled determination. The more empires tried to silence Africa, the louder the call for freedom became. Nationalism was no longer a spark, it was a roaring fire. Across the continent, Africans declared, "Our land, our labor, our lives belong to us, not to empire." The countdown to independence had begun. When the First World War erupted in 1914, Europe's rivalries spilled onto African soil. The continent, carved up by empire, became another battlefield. Its people pulled into a war that was not their own. African soldiers were conscripted by the millions. France drafted the tirailleurs sénégalais, sending them to fight in Europe's trenches. Britain recruited men from Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, sending them to battle in East Africa, the Middle East, and Europe itself. Germany, too, armed African askaris in its colonies, making the continent a stage for war. The East African campaign was long and brutal. African porters carried supplies for thousands of miles through jungles and savannas, often barefoot, often starving. Disease killed more than bullets. Villages were raided for food, families displaced, fields destroyed. For many Africans, the war brought only suffering. Yet, it also brought new awareness. Soldiers saw the fragility of European armies, men who claimed to be masters of the world, now bleeding and dying like anyone else. Returning veterans asked, if we fought for freedom in Europe, why should we remain enslaved at home? The First World War weakened colonial powers but tightened their grip on Africa. Taxes increased, land seizures expanded, and resentment deepened. The war may have ended in Europe in 1918, but in Africa, its wounds lingered long after. When the Second World War erupted in 1939, Africa once again became a battlefield for Europe's rivalries. Colonial powers drafted millions of Africans into service, soldiers, porters, and laborers, forcing them into a global conflict far from their homes. In North Africa, deserts turned into war zones. Battles at El Alamein, Tobruk, and Kasserine Pass raged as British, German, Italian, and American armies clashed. African troops fought on both sides, French colonial soldiers against Germans, Italian askaris against the British. In East Africa, Ethiopians fought to reclaim their land from Mussolini's Italy, with Emperor Haile Selassie leading the call for liberation. Africans were sent far beyond their continent. Soldiers from Senegal, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa fought in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. They carried rifles, drove trucks, and dug trenches, essential but rarely honored. Hundreds of thousands died, not only from combat but from disease, exhaustion, and poor treatment. Yet the war changed Africa profoundly. Africans saw European armies defeated, humiliated, and dependent on their colonies for survival. They returned home with new perspectives, asking, if we could die for Europe's freedom, why are we still denied our own? The war also inspired leaders. Figures like Jomo Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, and Felix Houphouët-Boigny gained momentum, connecting independence with the global fight for democracy. The promises of freedom made during wartime rang hollow when empires tried to tighten control afterward. World War II cracked the illusion of European invincibility. It was the beginning of the end, the empire's last gasp before Africa's storm of liberation. By the late 1940s and 1950s, the world was changing. The empires of Europe, exhausted by 2 world wars, could no longer hold their colonies with the same iron grip. Across Africa, the winds of change began to blow. Colonial subjects who had fought in World War II returned home with new determination. They had risked their lives for the promise of liberty, only to find the same chains waiting for them. Their patience was gone. A new generation of leaders rose, men and women educated in mission schools, universities in Europe, and trade unions in cities. They spoke not only of reform, but of independence. Figures like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, and Leopold Senghor in Senegal called for freedom. Their words lit fires in the hearts of millions. Across the continent, strikes, protests, and uprisings shook colonial administrations. Railways halted, plantations stood still, and students marched through city streets. demanding equality. Even in parliaments in London and Paris, questions began to echo: could empire survive the 20th century? In 1960, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan admitted what could no longer be denied: the wind of change is blowing through this continent. But Africans already knew. It was the storm they had been waiting for. The 1950s and 1960s became the age of independence. Across Africa, empires crumbled one by one as nations broke free. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African country to win independence, with Kwame Nkrumah declaring, "Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked with the total liberation of Africa." His words inspired a wave that swept across the continent. Nigeria followed in 1960, Algeria in 1962 after a bloody war, Kenya in 1963, and dozens more in rapid succession. Flags of empire were lowered, and new national banners rose under the African sun. But independence was not always peaceful. In Algeria, the War of Liberation claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. In the Congo, independence brought chaos and foreign interference. In Kenya, the Mau Mau rebellion left scars of brutality on both sides. Still, nothing could stop the tide. From Cairo to Cape Town, Africans celebrated the birth of nations. Cities erupted with parades, drums, and dancing. The world watched as Africa reclaimed its voice. Yet challenges lay ahead. Borders drawn in Berlin remained. Economies built for empire were weak, and political divisions threatened unity. Still, for the first time in centuries, Africa was free to decide its future. The fall of empires was not the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter. Every movement needs leaders, voices to turn whispers into thunder. In Africa's struggle for freedom, two such giants stood tall: Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya. Nkrumah, born in the Gold Coast, studied abroad, and returned with a fiery vision. Africa must be free. He founded the Convention People's Party, CPP, and rallied thousands with the cry, "Self-government now." His speeches filled stadiums. His charisma ignited hearts. Colonial authorities arrested him, but the people refused to abandon him. Even from prison, his influence grew. In 1957, when Ghana became independent, Nkrumah stood before the world, declaring that Ghana's freedom was only the beginning, that all of Africa must rise together. On the other side of the continent, Jomo Kenyatta led the fight in Kenya. Nicknamed the Burning Spear, he became the face of the movement against British rule. During the Mau Mau uprising, he was imprisoned for years, accused of inspiring rebellion. Yet his spirit did not break. When independence finally came in 1963, Kenyatta emerged as the nation's first prime minister, guiding Kenya into a new era. These men were not perfect, but they were symbols. To millions, they proved that Africa's chains could be broken, and that new nations could stand proud beneath the sun of freedom. The fight for Africa's freedom also produced leaders whose courage came at a heavy cost. Among them stood Patrice Lumumba of the Congo and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. Patrice Lumumba, a brilliant orator, rose to prominence in the Belgian Congo. In 1960, he declared independence with fiery words: "We are no longer your monkeys, we are Congolese." His speech shocked Belgian officials who expected gratitude, not defiance. Lumumba's vision was bold: an independent Congo, united and sovereign. But within months, he was overthrown in a coup, backed by foreign powers, and in 1961, assassinated. His death made him a martyr, his words echoing as prophecy for generations. In contrast, Julius Nyerere of Tanganyika, later Tanzania, believed in peaceful struggle. A teacher by training, he became known as Mwalimu, the teacher. He preached unity, education, and African socialism. Under his leadership, Tanganyika gained independence in 1961 without bloodshed. He urged Africans to reclaim dignity through collective effort and self-reliance. Together, Lumumba and Nyerere represented two paths, one fiery, one patient, but both aimed at the same dream: a free and united Africa. Their legacies endure, reminders of both the cost and the promise of liberation. By the 1960s and 1970s, most of Africa had broken free from colonial rule. Flags of empire were lowered, and new nations were born. Yet not all chains were broken. Some colonies remained under European control for decades longer, their people forced to fight even harder for freedom. In southern Africa, white minority regimes clung to power. In Rhodesia, today Zimbabwe, settlers declared unilateral independence in 1965, determined to maintain white dominance. For Africans, the struggle became long and bloody, with liberation fighters waging guerrilla wars from the countryside. In Namibia, South Africa imposed apartheid rule, exploiting its resources while suppressing its people. The liberation movement, SWAPO, Southwest Africa People's Organization, fought relentlessly, enduring imprisonment, exile, and massacres. In South Africa, apartheid itself became the darkest remnant of colonialism. Millions of black South Africans were segregated, stripped of rights, and forced into homelands. Leaders like Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress, ANC, carried the torch of resistance, even from prison cells. The last African nation to win independence was Eritrea, in 1993, after a 30-year war against Ethiopia. Its victory symbolized both endurance and sacrifice. The road to liberation was long, uneven, and costly. But Africa's last colonies proved that no matter how powerful the oppressor, freedom, though delayed, could never be denied. When Europe divided Africa at the Berlin Conference, it ignored cultures, histories, and communities. Those lines, drawn with rulers and ink, became the borders of modern African states. And long after the empires fell, those borders remained. Entire nations were created out of fragments. Nigeria united hundreds of ethnic groups. The Democratic Republic of Congo encompassed dozens of languages and traditions. Some families found themselves separated by colonial lines. Somalis divided between 5 states. You people split between Ghana and Togo. These borders often became fault lines. Civil wars erupted, fueled by ethnic rivalries and political struggles created by artificial divisions. In Nigeria, the Biafran War 1967-1970 claimed millions of lives. In Rwanda, colonial manipulation of ethnic categories helped set the stage for the 1994 genocide. At the same time, border disputes became common. Eritrea and Ethiopia, Morocco and Western Sahara, Sudan and South Sudan, all bore the burden of lines drawn by men who never set foot on the land. Yet Africa also found resilience. The Organization of African Unity, OAU, in 1963 made the bold decision to keep colonial borders intact, choosing stability over endless redrawing. The challenge became not to erase these scars but to heal them. The legacy of borders is a reminder: empire's decisions outlasted its rule. But Africa continues to redefine those lines, not as barriers of division, but as bridges of unity. Independence brought freedom, but not prosperity. The economic systems left behind by colonial powers were designed for extraction, not development. Railroads still led from mines to ports, plantations still grew cash crops for export, and industries were scarce. New African nations inherited economies dependent on Europe. They sold raw materials, cocoa, copper, oil, only to buy back manufactured goods at high prices. This cycle trapped them in neo-colonialism, a system where independence was political, but economic power remained abroad. International loans promised progress but often deepened dependency. In the 1970s and 1980s, debt crises swept across the continent. Governments borrowed heavily, then struggled to repay, forcing harsh austerity measures that cut education, healthcare, and food subsidies. Ordinary Africans bore the suffering. Corruption also grew. Some leaders enriched themselves while their people starved, creating disillusionment after the joy of independence. Civil wars, fueled by Cold War rivalries, further devastated fragile economies. Yet Africans adapted with resilience. Informal markets thrived. Communities relied on cooperation and creativity to survive. Farmers cultivated local crops, women built small businesses, and urban youth reshaped economies from the ground up. The economic aftershocks of colonialism were heavy, but Africa was not defeated. Its people carried determination, building step by step towards self-reliance, even as the shadow of empire lingered in their markets and banks. Though colonialism tried to erase Africa's soul, independence brought a cultural revival. Across the continent, people began reclaiming their identities, languages, music, art, and traditions once forbidden returned with pride. Writers like Chinua Achebe in Nigeria and Nyanga Wathionga in Kenya rejected colonial narratives, telling Africa's stories in their own voices. Poets, novelists, and playwrights infused literature with the rhythms of African life, reminding the world that Africa had always had history, memory, and meaning. Musicians revived drums, mbiras, chorus, and balafons. New genres like Afrobeat, led by Fela Kuti, carried political messages through music, inspiring millions. Dance, long suppressed by missionaries, exploded again in festivals, weddings, and ceremonies. Traditional dress returned to the forefront: kente cloth in Ghana, shuka in Kenya, isiZulu beadwork in South Africa, symbols of pride and resistance. Languages once mocked in schools were taught again to children. Even religion transformed. Christianity and Islam remained strong, but indigenous faiths regained respect, woven proudly into Africa's spiritual landscape. This cultural revival was more than celebration, it was resistance. It reminded Africans that independence was not only about borders and governments, but also about reclaiming the heartbeat of their identity. The revival continues today, as African artists, filmmakers, and designers carry traditions into the modern world, proving that Africa is not only surviving its history, it is shaping its future. Today, Africa stands not as the dark continent once described by colonizers, but as a vibrant, complex, and resilient force in the modern world. Its cities pulse with life: Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, Accra, and Addis Ababa are hubs of commerce, innovation, and culture. African entrepreneurs lead in technology, creating fintech revolutions and pioneering mobile banking. Youth-driven movements use social media to connect across borders, mobilize protests, and share creativity globally. Africa is rich not only in resources but in human potential. It is the youngest continent on Earth, with more than half its population under 25. Its energy, music, fashion, and art now influence global culture. Afrobeats fills dance floors in New York, London, and Tokyo. Nollywood films captivate millions. Yet challenges remain. The legacy of colonialism lingers in fragile borders, economic struggles, and political instability. Climate change threatens crops and water sources. Corruption and inequality persist. But Africa has shown that it does not bow. It adapts, resists, and reinvents. In the African Union, nations seek unity, echoing the dreams of leaders like Nkrumah. Pan-African pride continues to grow, reshaping how Africa sees itself and how the world sees Africa. Modern Africa is not defined by what was taken, but by what endures: resilience, creativity, and an unbroken will to rise. The Scramble for Africa was one of the most violent and transformative episodes in human history. It left scars that still shape nations, communities, and identities today. But it also left lessons the world must never forget. The first lesson is that greed knows no borders. Empires drew lines across Africa not for the benefit of its people, but for profit and power. The cost was millions of lives, broken societies, and stolen futures. It reminds us that when power is unchecked, humanity suffers. The second lesson is that resistance is eternal. From the Zulu at Isandlwana to the Ethiopians at Idwa, from the Momo forests to Mandela's prison cell, Africans never stopped fighting. Their courage proves that no oppression is absolute. Freedom may be delayed, but it cannot be denied forever. The third lesson is about unity. Colonial powers thrived on division, and the borders they drew still cause conflict today. Yet Africa's future depends on solidarity, on remembering that strength lies not in fragmentation, but in shared destiny. Finally, the story of the Scramble is not just Africa's story, it is humanity's. It asks us, what kind of world do we wish to build? One of conquest and greed, or one of dignity and justice? The Scramble for Africa ended empires, but it did not end Africa. Out of the storm rose a continent scarred but unbroken, wounded but alive. Its story is not tragedy, it is survival, resistance, and rebirth. Dear friends, you have walked with me through a journey across centuries, through kingdoms and empires, through chains and battles, through sorrow and triumph. You have seen how Africa was divided, exploited, and scarred. But you have also seen how it endured, resisted, and rose again. The Scramble for Africa is not just history, it is a mirror. It shows us what happens when greed outweighs humanity, when power silences justice, and when division is chosen over unity. But it also reminds us of the strength of the human spirit, the courage to resist, and the unbreakable will to be free. Today, Africa stands not as a victim of the past, but as a continent of hope, young, vibrant, and full of possibility. Its music fills the world, its innovations shape the future, its voices rise louder every day. So, as you leave this story behind, remember, history is not just to be studied, it is to be learned from. Let the lessons of Africa's struggle guide us to build a world not of conquest, but of dignity, justice, and unity. This is not the end of Africa's story. It is only the beginning of its rebirth.